Let's get started on Module 3, Creating Virtual Machines. In this module, we will look at virtual machine concepts and we will create virtual machines. First, we will create a virtual machine and install the guest operating system, and then we will discuss virtual machine concepts. So let's start out with creating a virtual machine. A virtual machine is created on an ESXi host. So you and I, sitting at our workstation, use the vSphere client to connect to the ESXi host so we can create a virtual machine on that ESXi host. To connect to the ESXi host, we click on the VMware desktop vSphere client and we type in the IP address, administrator name, and administrator password for that ESXi host. And now we are logged into the ESXi host. If we look at the Virtual Machines tab, we can see that there are no virtual machines created on this ESXi host. To create a virtual machine, I right-click on the host and select New Virtual Machine. Under Configuration, I select Custom, followed by Next, and then I assign the virtual machine a name. I will call this File Server 1 because it's just going to be a small file server, followed by Next. Then I specify the data store onto which this virtual machine will be created, and since I only have one disk, I just select the one disk that I have, followed by Next. Then we have something called virtual machine or version. Since we are going to be using the latest version of ESXi, which is ESXi 6, then we will be using the latest virtual machine version, which is virtual machine version 11. If we needed to be backwardly compatible with old ESXi 3 or ESXi 4 or ESXi 5, then we might select an older version of the virtual machine version. But since we are using the latest version on the ESXi host, then we will select virtual machine version 11, followed by Next. We select the operating system we are going to install, whether it be Linux or Windows, and we select the edition of Windows that we are going to install. In this example, I will select Windows Server 2012 64-bit. But you can see there are many operating systems which are supported. This is just the example that we are doing. Followed by Next. Then we specify the number of CPUs which will be assigned to this virtual machine. I could assign 4, but this is not going to be a real heavy-duty machine, so I'm just going to assign 1 CPU. And then I can specify the number of cores that I want to be assigned per CPU. And I could assign 4 cores, but as I said, this is a pretty lightweight server, so I'm just going to assign 1 CPU, 1 core, because that's all I need. If I want to come back later and assign more CPUs, I certainly can, followed by Next. Then, how much RAM are we going to allocate to this virtual machine? I could allocate 32 gig, but I really don't need it. So I will just allocate 4 gig. If I want to come back later and allocate 32 gig, I certainly can. But for the moment, I will just select 4 gig, followed by Next. Then we can see that we will have one virtual network interface card which is connected to the default virtual network, which is simply called VM network. And notice that this virtual adapter, the E1000, emulates the Intel 82.545EM gigabit Ethernet NIC. And this is one of the most commonly used network interface cards, and it's compatible with virtually all new operating systems. We select the E1000, followed by Next. Then we select the type of SCSI controller that we are going to use. Since we are installing a new operating system, we will select the LSI, Large Scale Integration, Logic SAS Serial Attached Storage. Now, if I were installing an older operating system like old Windows 2000, then I might select an older SCSI controller. We will discuss paravirtualized later in the course. Click on Next. Then we will select Create a New Virtual Hard Disk, followed by Next. and we will specify that the capacity of the virtual hard disk is 40 gig. Now, I could make it bigger, but 40 gig is all I need for now, and I can certainly increase it later if necessary. And then we have these 3 disk provisioning methods: thick provision, lazy 0, thick provision, eager 0, and thin provision. Thick provision, lazy 0, when you select that, then when you create the virtual disk, it will allocate space on the physical hard disk for the virtual hard disk. If you select thick provision, eager 0, it will allocate space on the physical hard disk for the virtual hard disk, and it will overwrite all existing data with 1s to guarantee that any existing data gets wiped. But what we like to use in this course is thin provision, because when you use thin provision, it really doesn't take any space on the physical hard disk until data is actually stored to the virtual disk. We prefer to use thin provision because it takes a lot less space on the disk. Click on Next. Then under Virtual Device Mode, we typically select SCSI Controller Card 0, Hard Disk 0, and you see an option here called Independent Mode. And if you select Independent Mode, you can see that independent disks are not affected by snapshots. And we have Persistent Mode, and with Persistent Mode, changes written to the hard disk will be permanently written to the hard disk, and that makes perfect sense. That's what you would expect. But there's another one here that's a little confusing called non-persistent. With non-persistent, any changes written to the hard disk will be discarded when the virtual machine is powered off. This would not be used with the server operating system. That's what we are installing. It might be used if you're creating a virtual workstation operating system, but we're not. This is a server operating system, so we want changes to be persistent, and we also do want to use snapshots. So we just leave it at the default node, followed by Next. So now we can see that we will create a virtual machine called File Server 1, 1 CPU, 4 gig of RAM, 1 virtual network interface card, 40 gig virtual hard disk, thin provision, node type is persistent. I click on Finish, and we can see we have created a new virtual machine. If we click on the Summary tab, we can see that the virtual machine has 1 CPU and 4 gig of RAM. Now let's take a look at this virtual machine. To look at the console for this virtual machine, you will see that there is a button right here that says Launch Virtual Machine Console. It's a picture of a little monitor with a little green arrow pointing to it. If we click that, it brings up the virtual machine console. So now we're looking at the virtual machine, and there's nothing to see because it's not turned on. So to turn on the virtual machine, we click on the green arrow. And what that does is it boots the virtual machine. The virtual machine boots, and we get an error message that says operating system not found. Well, that's because we have created the virtual machine, but we have not yet installed the operating system. So the next thing to do is to install the guest operating system in the virtual machine. In this example, I will install Windows Server, but it could just as easily be Linux. To get an evaluation copy of Windows Server, you go to Microsoft.com, and just like VMware, they want you to download these free evaluation copies so you'll like it and buy it. And you can download the install disk for Windows Server, and you can download the ISO to your own workstation and then burn that to the DVD, so now you have a Windows Server install DVD. So to install the guest operating system, you put the Windows Install DVD in the DVD reader in the ESXi host, you reboot the virtual machine, and the virtual machine should boot to the Windows Install DVD. So I go to the virtual machine, select Power, followed by Reset, and it restarts the virtual machine, and then it boots to the Windows 2012 Install DVD. Now the purpose of this class is not to teach Windows Server, but typically, right after you create a virtual machine, the first thing you do is to install the guest operating system. So let's just do a review of Windows installation. And you will see that when you install Windows in a virtual machine, it's nearly identical to installing it into a physical machine. So to proceed with the installation, we click on Next. We select the edition that we want to install, which is just Standard Edition, followed by Next. We accept the licensing agreement, followed by Next. Under Type of Installation, we select Custom Install Windows Only. Because we're doing a clean install, we select Custom. And then we select the virtual disk that we previously created to install Windows on. Click on Next. And now you can see that the install files are being copied from the install DVD to the virtual disk, which is on the virtual machine. And then once the files have finished copying, then the virtual machine reboots, and then you can log in as administrator, and now you can see that Windows Server has been installed on a virtual machine. Now, typically, the next thing to do would be to assign this Windows Server a computer name, a domain name, and an IP address, because when you do an initial installation, the computer name is a randomly generated number, and it is not assigned a static IP address. So let's take care of both of those things. To assign a computer name, we just click on the randomly generated name and then type in the new computer name, or the host name, which is called File Server 1, and the DNS suffix for us will be ccbcmd.edu. We click on OK, and then to assign an IP address to the rate of Ethernet, we select IP addresses assigned, and we type in an IP address, a subnet mask, a default gateway, DNS server, followed by OK. So we've installed the operating system, and we have assigned it a static IP address. VMware Tools. So after installing the guest operating system, then you install VMware Tools. To install VMware Tools, you go to the virtual machine console for that virtual machine, then click on VM, followed by Guest, followed by Install/Upgrade VMware Tools. And in the description, you can see that installing VMware Tools will greatly enhance graphics and mouse performance in your virtual machine. We click on OK. Welcome to the installation wizard for VMware Tools. We click on Next. It installs VMware Tools. Installation wizard complete. I click on Finish, and now it wants us to reboot. So I click on Yes. It restarts the virtual machine, reloads Windows Server, and then I log in, and there's my computer name, File Server 1, and if I look at the summary for that virtual machine, we can see that VMware Tools is currently installed and running. So we've created the virtual machine, and we've installed the Windows Server operating system on the virtual machine. Now the users can access the Windows Server, which is running on the virtual machine. The users standing at their workstations can now access the Windows Server, which is running on the virtual machine on the ESXi host, which is in the server room. Now, let me ask a question. Compared to a typical server-based network, what's the difference to the users? And you're going to see there is no difference. If a user is accessing an operating system on a typical server-based network where each operating system is in a separate physical box, the user will access it. If it's a typical server-based network, and if it's a virtual network infrastructure, the user will access the operating system, which is running a virtual machine, which is running on the ESXi host, and the difference to the user is none. The user can't tell the difference between accessing an operating system on a separate physical box versus accessing an operating system which is running on a virtual machine on an ESXi host. Well, maybe it'll be a little bit faster if this is a new ESXi host. Allocating more resources. If the load on the server has increased, then you might want to assign more CPUs, more RAM, and more disk space. When we installed this virtual machine, we only gave it 1 CPU and 4 gig of RAM. And if we come back later, 6 months later, and we see that processor utilization and disk utilization are just through the ceiling, then what we can do is go back and assign more disk space and more memory. So I go to my virtual machine, right-click, select Edit Settings, and under Memory, you can see we previously assigned it 4 gig. I can assign it 8 gig of memory, assuming I have 8 gig free on the ESXi host. Previously, we only assigned it 1 CPU. If we want, we could assign it 4 CPUs. Previously, we assigned only 40 gig of hard disk space, but we can assign 160 gig of hard disk space. We can assign more RAM, additional CPUs, and greater disk space. In summary, in this section we talked about creating a virtual machine. The virtual machine is created on the ESXi host. So, you use the vSphere desktop client to connect to the ESXi host. Then you create the virtual machine and assign hardware resources, a certain amount of RAM, a certain number of CPUs. Then you install and configure the guest operating system and install VMware tools, and then the users can then access the operating system in that virtual machine. If later on you find that that operating system in the virtual machine has been overloaded or the demand has grown, then you can assign additional hardware resources as necessary. And this concludes part 1.